how the Kremlin uses comics to glorify its war in Ukraine. War-themed comic books are being used by the Kremlin to sell its vision of the war in Ukraine to the youth. During the first months following the start of invasion of Ukraine, a poll by the Russian state pollster suggested that young Russians were the least supportive of the war. It now seems the Kremlin is taking steps to ensure that changes. In April, the Russian Defense and Education Ministries started distributing tens of thousands of comic books that praise the invasion of Ukraine in schools across Russia and Ukraine's Russia-occupied territories. According to the project's official website, the goal is ultimately to supply these comics to every school under Russian control. The comics consist of 22 short stories dedicated to Russian servicemen decorated for their role in the war. They echo the Kremlin's unfounded claim that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 prevented a genocide planned by Kiev authorities in eastern Ukraine and backed by NATO countries. Among the protagonists is Kolgen Azatbek Omervikov, the commanding officer of the unit responsible for the killing of civilians in the Ukrainian town of Bucha in 2022. The comic book describes Mr. Omervikov as a real man and claims that his troops have shown humanity during the first months of the war in Ukraine. As they, Ukrainian soldiers, retreated, the enemy abandoned their wounded. Russian soldiers gave them first aid. Even in war, one must remain human, the comic reads. In fact, Russian troops have been accused of torturing and killing Ukrainian prisoners of war by major rights groups, including Amnesty International and the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. The books were written by Oleg Roy, a prominent Russian children's author and a vocal supporter of the war in Ukraine. The comics employ the anti-Western, anti-NATO, and anti-Ukrainian rhetoric long peddled by Russian authorities. Out of hatred for Russia, the West arms their puppy neo-Nazis in occupied Kiev. One of the books reads, Mr. Roy previously created a series of comics devoted to patriotic Russian superheroes, which were praised by Kremlin-backed media as Russia's answer to DC and Marvel. In September 2023, another series of 23 war-themed comics was issued by prominent military blogger Mikhail Zvinchuk, who is also part of the Russian Presidential Council on the war in Ukraine. These comics were translated in English, Arabic, and Chinese. The stories they tell claim to be based on real-life situations from the war in Ukraine. They highlight the courage and determination of Russian soldiers, while derogatory language is used to describe Ukrainian soldiers, who are portrayed as pawns of Western generals. Some of the stories also echo the narratives of Russian state-controlled media, claiming that Ukrainian soldiers lack the motivation to fight, as their commanding officers send them to die. One of Zvinchuk's comic books describes the battle for the eastern Ukrainian village of Klishivka, which Russia has since claimed to have captured. It tells the story of a Ukrainian soldier named Mykola, who surrenders to Russian troops, shoots members of his own battalion, and changes his name to Nikolai, the Russian variant of his name. In another issue, 2 Ukrainian drone operators are desperate and forced to surrender because they cannot handle the might of Russian armored vehicles, which one of them calls cyborgs. Mr. Zvinchuk's comics were showcased as part of an art exhibition set up on a train that traveled across Russia. The train featured 9 thematic cars depicting the heroism of Russian soldiers, starting with World War II and ending with the war in Ukraine. According to official data, more than 500,000 people visited the Ministry of Defense-backed initiative, which was dubbed the Power of Truth. The train covered more than 34,000 kilometers, 21,200 miles, stopping in more than 75 cities between Moscow and Russia's Far East. Another series of Ukraine war-related comics is centered around the exploits of the Russian Wagner mercenary group and its late founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, although this series appears to have no official backing. Wagner mercenaries have been involved in wars in Ukraine and in Syria. Prigozhin died in plane crash on 23 August exactly 2 months after he led a short-lived mutiny, during which his fighters took over key military installations in southern Russia and began marching towards Moscow. The comics, which were published at the end of 2023 on social media platform Telegram, glorify Wagner mercenaries and claim they saved Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine from genocide. The protagonist is a Wagner mercenary called Angel of Wrath, who is depicted fighting blue dog-like creatures wearing the Ukrainian coat of arms.